Hear now the word of the Lord from Deuteronomy chapter 15. At the end of every 7 years you shall grant a release, and this is the manner of the release. Every creditor shall release what he has lent to his neighbor. He shall not exact it of his neighbor, his brother, because the Lord's release has been proclaimed. Of a foreigner you may exact it, but whatever of yours is with your brother, your hand shall release. But there will be no poor among you. For the Lord will bless you in the land that the Lord your God is giving you for an inheritance to possess, if only you will strictly obey the voice of the Lord your God, being careful to do all this commandment that I command you today. For the Lord your God will bless you as he promised you, and shall lend to many nations. But you shall not borrow, and you shall not rule over many nations, but they shall not rule over you. If among you one of your brothers should become poor in any of your towns within your land that the Lord your God is giving you, you shall not harden your heart or shut your hand against your poor brother. But you shall open your hand to him and lend him sufficient for his need, whatever it may be. Take care lest there be any unworthy thought in your heart, and you say, the 7th year, the year of release is near, and your eye looks grudgingly on your poor brother, and you give him nothing, and he cry to the Lord against you, and you be guilty of sin. You shall give to him freely, and your heart shall not be grudging when you give to him, because for this the Lord your God will bless you in all your work and in all that you undertake. For there will never cease to be poor in the land. Therefore, I command you, you shall open wide your hand to your brother, to the needy, and to the poor in your land. If your brother, a Hebrew man or a Hebrew woman, is sold to you, he shall serve you 6 years, and in the 7th year you shall let him go free from you. And when you let him go free from you, you shall not let him go empty-handed. You shall furnish him liberally out of your flock, out of your threshing floor, and out of your winepress. As the Lord your God has blessed you, you shall give to him. In this passage, Moses implements what God first commanded back in Leviticus 25, that every 7th year was to be a sabbatical year. Every 7th day is a Sabbath day where the people rest from their labors and focus on God. Every 7th year was to be a year of release for the land. No plowing, no planting. Let the land rest. How are the people supposed to eat if they don't plow and plant and harvest? God says, don't worry about that. I'm going to bless you so much in that 6th year that you'll be eating from that crop into the 9th year. See, when God blesses, it's not just a little bit. He blesses abundantly, overflowing, nothing to worry about. Here in Deuteronomy 15, as Israel prepares to enter Canaan and Moses prepares to die, Moses relays God's command now to the people. And he tells them that the release every 7th year is not just for the land, it's for them too. Hebrew slaves are to be released, given their freedom. Hebrews in debt are to be released from those debts, along with any property used as collateral. And the reasoning is simple, although it sounds impossible. It sounds somewhat utopian in verse 4 when Moses says, there will be no poor among you, for the Lord will bless you. We should understand that this plan applies only to the Israelites. Moses said, if some foreigner owes you money, you don't release them unless you want to. Only among your fellow Israelites, or what the text calls your brothers, is there to be this release. But the utopian pipe dream of verse 4 is somewhat shattered in verses 7 and 11, is it not? In verse 7, Moses admits the possibility that someone in Israel might become poor. And verse 11 just presents the reality where Moses says there will always be poor people in Israel, always. That's the same thing Jesus said in John chapter 12, isn't it? After Judas complained about the expensive ointment being poured out on Jesus by Mary, Judas says, we could have sold that perfume for a year's wages and given all the money to the poor. And Jesus says, leave her alone. The poor you have with you always, but you'll not always have me. There will always be poor people. That's the reality. And how should they be treated? Look at the last part of verse 11 where Moses says, you shall open wide your hand to your brother, to the needy and to the poor in your land. Verse 7 says, you shall not harden your heart or shut your hand against your poor brother. Verse 9, take care lest there be an unworthy thought in your heart. You see, taking care of the poor isn't about obedience to a command. It's a matter of the heart, a soft heart, and an open hand. Soft-hearted, not hard-hearted. Open-handed, not tight-fisted. Well, how did Israel do with this once they entered the land of Canaan? Well, we know they didn't do well with it at all. They disobeyed God. They turned to idols. Their idolatry led to rampant mistreatment of one another, injustice. And there were poor people everywhere. Think about 2 Kings chapter 4, where the poor widow of one of the prophets comes to Elisha and says, my husband is dead, and to get a loan, I had to use my 2 sons as collateral. And guess who's knocking at the door wanting my boys? Amos chapter 2, the prophet rails against Israel for their injustice. He says, essentially, Israel, you sell the righteous for silver, the poor for a pair of flip-flops. You stomp on the heads of the poor into the dust. You say no to those who are afflicted. You take clothing from them as a loan payment, and then you use that to pad your bed. God says, you come into my house drunk on the wine of those who've been fined. Then 100 years later, Jeremiah denounces Judah for the very same thing. Chapter 34 of that great book, God speaking through the prophet, says, your fathers never obeyed the sabbatical year. However, you repented, you've honored my name, you've released your slave neighbors, but then you turned right around and dishonored me by taking all those slaves back in. Therefore, God says, I release you to death by sword and by pestilence and by famine. I'm going to make you a horror to every kingdom on earth. Now, I think we'd all agree that these commands were certainly made a long, long time ago to a people who are not us. People of a completely different culture, time, and situation. And yet times change, for sure. Cultures change, situations change. But folks, God never changes. God's attitudes regarding the poor have not changed over the millennia. We too are to be a soft-hearted and open-handed people. Why? Because it honors God. When we give of ourselves and give of our means to others, God is honored. And we want to honor God, don't we? By having compassion on the poor, by giving to them generously. And some might say, well, how generously? Well, even to the point of giving up our lives. Isn't that what John says? 1 John chapter 3, beginning in verse 17. Let's back up and begin with verse 16, where the apostle writes, by this we know love, that Christ laid down his life for us, and we ought to lay down our lives for the brothers. But if anyone has the world's goods and sees his brother in need, yet closes his heart against him, how does God's love abide in him? Little children, let us not love in word or talk, but in deeds and truth. See, that kind of generous compassion begins right here in the church. Galatians chapter 6, Paul writes this, let us not grow weary of doing good, for in due season we will reap if we do not give up. So then, as we have opportunity, let us do good to everyone, and especially to those who are of the household of faith. Allow me to read that last part again, lest we misunderstand. Let us do good to everyone, and especially to those who are of the household of faith. Church first, but then everybody else. Folks, I'm not sure there's any way for us to better distinguish ourselves from the rest of the world than through our compassion and generosity to the poor. I'm not sure there's a better way to look like God in the world. His compassion and generosity towards us are limitless. May we imitate God by being soft-hearted and open-handed with poor people. I want to leave you tonight with 1 John chapter 4, where the apostle writes this. So we have come to know and to believe the love that God has for us. God is love, and whoever abides in love abides in God, and God abides in him. By this is love perfected with us, so that we may have confidence for the day of judgment, because as he is, so also are we in this world. We love because he first loved us. If anyone says, I love God, and hates his brother, he's a liar. For he who does not love his brother whom he has seen cannot love God whom he has not seen. And this command we have from him: whoever loves God must also love his brother. Soft hearts and open hands. That's how you honor God. That's how we show Jesus to the world. Have a blessed week.